This audiobook is made by RealmofAudiobook.
Women in Love by D. H. Lawrence. Sisters. Ursula and Gudrun Brangwen sat one morning in the window bay of their father's house in Beldover, working and talking. Ursula was stitching a piece of brightly colored embroidery, and Gudrun was drawing upon a board which she held on her knee. They were mostly silent, talking as their thoughts strayed through their minds. "Ursula," said Gudrun, "don't you really want to get married?" Ursula laid her embroidery in her lap and looked up. Her face was calm and considerate. "I don't know," she replied. "It depends how you mean." Gudrun was slightly taken aback. She watched her sister for some moments. "Well," she said ironically, "it usually means one thing. But don't you think anyhow you'd be," she darkened slightly, "in a better position than you are in now?" A shadow came over Ursula's face. "I might," she said, "but I'm not sure." Again Gudrun paused, slightly irritated. She wanted to be quite definite. "You don't think one needs the experience of having been married?" she asked. "Do you think it need be an experience?" replied Ursula. "Bound to be, in some way or other," said Gudrun coolly. "Possibly undesirable, but bound to be an experience of some sort." "Not really," said Ursula. "More likely to be the end of experience." Gudrun sat very still to attend to this. "Of course," she said, "there's that to consider." This brought the conversation to a close. Gudrun, almost angrily, took up her rubber and began to rub out part of her drawing. Ursula stitched absorbedly. "You wouldn't consider a good offer?" asked Gudrun. "I think I've rejected several," said Ursula. "Really?" Gudrun flushed dark. "But anything really worthwhile? Have you really?" "1,000 a year, and an awfully nice man." "I liked him awfully," said Ursula. "Really? But weren't you fearfully tempted?" "In the abstract, but not in the concrete," said Ursula. "When it comes to the point, one isn't even tempted." "Oh, if I were tempted, I'd marry like a shot. I'm only tempted not to." The faces of both sisters suddenly lit up with amusement. "Isn't it an amazing thing?" cried Gudrun. "How strong the temptation is not to." They both laughed, looking at each other. In their hearts, they were frightened. There was a long pause, whilst Ursula stitched and Gudrun went on with her sketch. The sisters were women, Ursula 26 and Gudrun 25, but both had the remote, virgin look of modern girls, sisters of Artemis rather than of Hebe. Gudrun was very beautiful, passive, soft-skinned, soft-limbed. She wore a dress of dark blue silky stuff, with ruches of blue and green linen lace in the neck and sleeves, and she had emerald green stockings. Her look of confidence and diffidence contrasted with Ursula's sensitive expectancy. The provincial people, intimidated by Gudrun's perfect sang-froid and exclusive bareness of manner, said of her, "She is a smart woman." She had just come back from London, where she had spent several years, working at an art school, as a student, and living a studio life. "I was hoping now for a man to come along," Gudrun said, suddenly catching her underlip between her teeth, and making a strange grimace, half sly smiling, half anguish. Ursula was afraid. "So you have come home, expecting him here?" she laughed. "Oh, my dear," cried Gudrun, strident, "I wouldn't go out of my way to look for him. But if there did happen to come along a highly attractive individual of sufficient means, well..." She tailed off ironically. Then she looked searchingly at Ursula, as if to probe her. "Don't you find yourself getting bored?" she asked of her sister. "Don't you find that things fail to materialize?" "Nothing materializes. Everything withers in the bud." "What withers in the bud?" asked Ursula. "Oh, everything, oneself, things in general." There was a pause, whilst each sister vaguely considered her fate. "It does frighten one," said Ursula, and again there was a pause. "But do you hope to get anywhere by just marrying?" "It seems to be the inevitable next step," said Gudrun. Ursula pondered this, with a little bitterness. She was a class mistress herself, in Wiley Green Grammar School, as she had been for some years. "I know," she said, "it seems like that when one thinks in the abstract. But really imagine it. Imagine any man one knows. Imagine him coming home to one every evening and saying hello and giving one a kiss. There was a blank pause. "Yes," said Gudrun, in a narrowed voice. "It's just impossible. The man makes it impossible." "Of course there's children," said Ursula doubtfully. Gudrun's face hardened. "Do you really want children, Ursula?" she asked coldly. A dazzled, baffled look came on Ursula's face. "One feels it is still beyond one," she said. "Do you feel like that?" asked Gudrun. "I get no feeling whatever from the thought of bearing children." Gudrun looked at Ursula with a mask-like, expressionless face. Ursula knitted her brows. "Perhaps it isn't genuine," she faltered. "Perhaps one doesn't really want them, in one's soul, only superficially." A hardness came over Gudrun's face. She did not want to be too definite. "When one thinks of other people's children," said Ursula. Again Gudrun looked at her sister, almost hostile. "Exactly," she said, to close the conversation. The two sisters worked on in silence, Ursula having always that strange brightness of an essential flame that is caught, meshed, contravened. She lived a good deal by herself, to herself, working, passing on from day to day, and always thinking, trying to lay hold on life, to grasp it in her own understanding. Her active living was suspended, but underneath, in the darkness, something was coming to pass. If only she could break through the last integuments. She seemed to try and put her hands out, like an infant in the womb, and she could not yet. Still she had a strange prescience, an intimation of something yet to come. She laid down her work and looked at her sister. She thought Gudrun so charming, so infinitely charming, in her softness and her fine, exquisite richness of texture and delicacy of line. There was a certain playfulness about her too, such a piquancy or ironic suggestion, such an untouched reserve. Ursula admired her with all her soul. "Why did you come home, Prune?" she asked. Gudrun knew she was being admired. She sat back from her drawing and looked at Ursula from under her finely curved lashes. "Why did I come back, Ursula?" she repeated. "I have asked myself 1,000 times. And don't you know?" "Yes, I think I do. I think my coming back home was just for color pour me solder." And she looked with a long, slow look of knowledge at Ursula. "I know," cried Ursula, looking slightly dazzled and falsified, and as if she did not know. "But where can one jump to?" "Oh, it doesn't matter," said Gudrun, somewhat superbly. "If one jumps over the edge, one is bound to land somewhere." "But isn't it very risky?" asked Ursula. A slow mocking smile dawned on Gudrun's face. "Ah," she said, laughing, "what is it all but words?" And so again she closed the conversation. But Ursula was still brooding. "And how do you find home, now you have come back to it?" she asked. Gudrun paused for some moments coldly before answering. Then, in a cold, truthful voice, she said, "I find myself completely out of it. And father?" Gudrun looked at Ursula, almost with resentment, as if brought to bay. "I haven't thought about him. I've refrained," she said coldly. "Yes," wavered Ursula, and the conversation was really at an end. The sisters found themselves confronted by a void, a terrifying chasm, as if they had looked over the edge. They worked on in silence for some time. Gudrun's cheek was flushed with repressed emotion. She resented its having been called into being. "Shall we go out and look at that wedding?" she asked at length, in a voice that was too casual. "Yes," cried Ursula, too eagerly, throwing aside her sewing and leaping up, as if to escape something, thus betraying the tension of the situation and causing a friction of dislike to go over Gudrun's nerves. As she went upstairs, Ursula was aware of the house, of her home round about her, and she loathed it, the sordid, too familiar place. She was afraid at the depth of her feeling against the home, the milieu, the whole atmosphere and condition of this obsolete life. Her feeling frightened her. The two girls were soon walking swiftly down the main road of Beldova, a wide street, part shops, part dwelling houses, utterly formless and sordid, without poverty. Gudrun, new from her life in Chelsea and Sussex, shrank cruelly from this amorphous ugliness of a small colliery town in the Midlands. Yet forward she went, through the whole sordid gamut of pettiness, the long amorphous, gritty street. She was exposed to every stare. She passed on through a stretch of torment. It was strange that she should have chosen to come back and test the full effect of this shapeless, barren ugliness upon herself. Why had she wanted to submit herself to it? Did she still want to submit herself to it? The insufferable torture of these ugly, meaningless people, this defaced countryside. She felt like a beetle toiling in the dust. She was filled with repulsion. They turned off the main road, past a black patch of common garden, where sooty cabbage stumps stood shameless. No one thought to be ashamed. No one was ashamed of it all. It is like a country in an underworld, said Gudrun. The colliers bring it above ground with them. Shovel it up. Ursula, it's marvelous. It's really marvelous. It's really wonderful. Another world. The people are all ghouls, and everything is ghostly. Everything is a ghoulish replica of the real world. A replica, a ghoul, all soiled. Everything sorted. It's like being mad, Ursula. The sisters were crossing a black path through a dark, soiled field. On the left was a large landscape, a valley with collieries, and opposite hills with cornfields and woods, all blackened with distance, as if seen through a veil of crepe. White and black smoke rose up in steady columns, magic within the dark air. Near at hand came the long rows of dwellings, approaching curved up the hill slope, in straight lines along the brow of the hill. They were of darkened red brick, brittle, with dark slate roofs. The path on which the sisters walked was black, trodden in by the feet of the recurrent colliers, and bounded from the field by iron fences. The stile that led again into the road was rubbed shiny by the moleskins of the passing miners. Now the two girls were going between some rows of dwellings, of the poorer sort. Women, their arms folded over their coarse aprons, standing gossiping at the end of their block, stared after the Brangwen sisters with that long, unwearying stare of aborigines. Children called out names. Gudrun went on her way half-dazed. If this were human life, if these were human beings living in a complete world, then what was her own world outside? She was aware of her grass-green stockings, her large grass-green velour hat, her full soft coat, of a strong blue color, and she felt as if she were treading in the air, quite unstable. Her heart was contracted, as if at any minute she might be precipitated to the ground. She was afraid. She clung to Ursula, who, through long usage, was inured to this violation of a dark, uncreated, hostile world. But all the time her heart was crying, as if in the midst of some ordeal. I want to go back. I want to go away. I want not to know it. Not to know that this exists. Yet she must go forward. Ursula could feel her suffering. You hate this, don't you? She asked. It bewilders me, stammered Gudrun. You won't stay long, replied Ursula. And Gudrun went along, grasping at release. They drew away from the colliery region, over the curve of the hill, into the purer country of the other side, towards Wily Green. Still the faint glamour of blackness persisted over the fields and the wooded hills, and seemed darkly to gleam in the air. It was a spring day, chill, with snatches of sunshine. Yellow celandines showed out from the hedge bottoms, and in the cottage gardens of Wily Green, currant bushes were breaking into leaf, and little flowers were coming white on the gray alyssum that hung over the stone walls. Turning, they passed down the high road that went between high banks towards the church. There, in the lowest bend of the road, low under the trees, stood a little group of expectant people, waiting to see the wedding. The daughter of the chief mine owner of the district, Thomas Critch, was getting married to a naval officer. Let us go back, said Gudrun, swerving away. There are all those people. And she hung wavering in the road. Never mind them, said Ursula. They're all right. They all know me. They don't matter. But must we go through them? Asked Gudrun. They're quite all right, really, said Ursula, going forward. And together the two sisters approached the group of uneasy, watchful common people. They were chiefly women, colliers' wives of the more shiftless sort. They had watchful underworld faces. The two sisters held themselves tense and went straight towards the gate. The women made way for them, but barely sufficient, as if grudging to yield ground. The sisters passed in silence through the stone gateway and up the steps. On the red carpet, a policeman estimating their progress. "What price the stockings?" said a voice at the back of Gudrun. A sudden fierce anger swept over the girl, violent and murderous. She would have liked them all annihilated, cleared away, so that the world was left clear for her. How she hated walking up the churchyard path, along the red carpet, continuing in motion in their sight. "I won't go into the church," she said suddenly, with such final decision that Ursula immediately halted, turned round, and branched off up a small side path which led to the little private gate of the grammar school, whose grounds adjoined those of the church. Just inside the gate of the school shrubbery, outside the churchyard, Ursula sat down for a moment on the low stone wall under the laurel bushes to rest. Behind her, the large red building of the school rose up peacefully, the windows all open for the holiday. Over the shrubs, before her, were the pale roofs and tower of the old church. The sisters were hidden by the foliage. Gudrun sat down in silence. Her mouth was shut close, her face averted. She was regretting bitterly that she had ever come back. Ursula looked at her and thought how amazingly beautiful she was, flushed with discomfiture. But she caused a constraint over Ursula's nature, a certain weariness. Ursula wished to be alone, freed from the tightness, the enclosure of Gudrun's presence. "Are we going to stay here?" asked Gudrun. "I was only resting a minute," said Ursula, getting up as if rebuked. "We will stand in the corner by the Fives Court. We shall see everything from there." For the moment, the sunshine fell brightly into the churchyard. There was a vague scent of sap and of spring, perhaps of violets from off the graves. Some white daisies were out, bright as angels. In the air, the unfolding leaves of a copper beech were blood red. Punctually at 11 o'clock, the carriages began to arrive. There was a stir in the crowd at the gate, a concentration as a carriage drove up. Wedding guests were mounting up the steps and passing along the red carpet to the church. They were all gay and excited because the sun was shining. Gudrun watched them closely, with objective curiosity. She saw each one as a complete figure, like a character in a book, or a subject in a picture, or a marionette in a theater, a finished creation. She loved to recognize their various characteristics, to place them in their true light, give them their own surroundings, settle them forever as they passed before her along the path to the church. She knew them. They were finished, sealed and stamped and finished with for her. There was none that had anything unknown, unresolved, until the Krishes themselves began to appear. Then her interest was piqued. Here was something not quite so preconcluded. There came the mother, Mrs. Critch, with her eldest son, Gerald. She was a queer, unkempt figure, in spite of the attempts that had obviously been made to bring her into line for the day. Her face was pale, yellowish, with a clear, transparent skin. She leaned forward rather. Her features were strongly marked, handsome, with a tense, unseeing, predative look. Her colorless hair was untidy, wisps floating down onto her sack coat of dark blue silk from under her blue silk hat. She looked like a woman with a monomania, furtive almost, but heavily proud. Her son was of a fair, suntan type, rather above middle height, well-made, and almost exaggeratedly well-dressed. But about him also was the strange, guarded look, the unconscious glisten, as if he did not belong to the same creation as the people about him. Gudrun lighted on him at once. There was something northern about him that magnetized her. In his clear northern flesh and his fair hair was a glisten like sunshine refracted through crystals of ice. And he looked so new, unbroached, pure as an Arctic thing. Perhaps he was 30 years old, perhaps more. His gleaming beauty, maleness, like a young, good-humored, smiling wolf, did not blind her to the significant, sinister stillness in his bearing, the lurking danger of his unsubdued temper. His totem is the wolf, she repeated to herself. His mother is an old, unbroken wolf. And then she experienced a keen paroxysm, a transport, as if she had made some incredible discovery, known to nobody else on earth. A strange transport took possession of her. All her veins were in a paroxysm of violent sensation. "Good God," she exclaimed to herself. "What is this?" And then, a moment after, she was saying assuredly, "I shall know more of that man." She was tortured with desire to see him again, a nostalgia, a necessity to see him again, to make sure it was not all a mistake, that she was not deluding herself, that she really felt this strange and overwhelming sensation on his account, this knowledge of him in her essence, this powerful apprehension of him.
Am I
really singled out for him in some way? Is there really some pale gold, Arctic light that envelopes only us two? She asked herself. And she could not believe it. She remained in a muse, scarcely conscious of what was going on around. The bridesmaids were here, and yet the bridegroom had not come. Ursula wondered if something was amiss, and if the wedding would yet all go wrong. She felt troubled, as if it rested upon her. The chief bridesmaids had arrived. Ursula watched them come up the steps. One of them she knew, a tall, slow, reluctant woman with a weight of fair hair and a pale, long face. This was Hermione Rawdice, a friend of the Crishes. Now she came along, with her head held up, balancing an enormous flat hat of pale yellow velvet, on which were streaks of ostrich feathers, natural and gray. She drifted forward as if scarcely conscious, her long blanched face lifted up, not to see the world. She was rich. She wore a dress of silky, frail velvet, of pale yellow color, and she carried a lot of small rose-colored cyclamens. Her shoes and stockings were of brownish gray, like the feathers on her hat. Her hair was heavy. She drifted along with a peculiar fixity of the hips, a strange, unwilling motion. She was impressive in her lovely pale yellow and brownish rose, yet macabre, something repulsive. People were silent when she passed, impressed, roused, wanting to jeer, yet for some reason silenced. Her long, pale face that she carried lifted up, somewhat in the Rossetti fashion, seemed almost drugged, as if a strange mass of thoughts coiled in the darkness within her, and she was never allowed to escape. Ursula watched her with fascination. She knew her a little. She was the most remarkable woman in the Midlands. Her father was a Derbyshire baronet of the old school. She was a woman of the new school, full of intellectuality and heavy, nerve-worn with consciousness. She was passionately interested in reform. Her soul was given up to the public cause. But she was a man's woman. It was the manly world that held her. She had various intimacies of mind and soul with various men of capacity. Ursula knew, among these men, only Rupert Birkin, who was one of the school inspectors of the county. But Gudrun had met others in London. Moving with her artist friends in different kinds of society, Gudrun had already come to know a good many people of repute and standing. She had met Hermione twice, but they did not take to each other. It would be queer to meet again down here in the Midlands, where their social standing was so diverse, after they had known each other on terms of equality in the houses of sundry acquaintances in town. For Gudrun had been a social success, and had her friends among the slack aristocracy that keeps touch with the arts. Hermione knew herself to be well-dressed. She knew herself to be the social equal, if not far the superior, of anyone she was likely to meet in Wiley Green. She knew she was accepted in the world of culture and of intellect. She was a culturtrager, a medium for the culture of ideas. With all that was highest, whether in society or in thought or in public action or even in art, she was at one. She moved among the foremost, at home with them. No one could put her down. No one could make mock of her, because she stood among the first, and those that were against her were below her, either in rank, or in wealth, or in high association of thought and progress and understanding. So, she was invulnerable. All her life, she had sought to make herself invulnerable, unassailable, beyond reach of the world's judgment. And yet her soul was tortured, exposed. Even walking up the path to the church, confident as she was that in every respect she stood beyond all vulgar judgment, knowing perfectly that her appearance was complete and perfect, according to the first standards, yet she suffered a torture, under her confidence and her pride, feeling herself exposed to wounds and to mockery and to despite. She always felt vulnerable, there was always a secret chink in her armor. She did not know herself what it was. It was a lack of robust self. She had no natural sufficiency. There was a terrible void, a lack, a deficiency of being within her. And she wanted someone to close up this deficiency, to close it up forever. She craved for Rupert Birkin. When he was there, she felt complete. She was sufficient whole. For the rest of time, she was established on the sand, built over a chasm, and, in spite of all her vanity and securities, any common maidservant of positive, robust temper could fling her down this bottomless pit of insufficiency by the slightest movement of jeering or contempt. And all the while the pensive, tortured woman piled up her own defenses of aesthetic knowledge and culture and world visions and disinterestedness. Yet she could never stop up the terrible gap of insufficiency. If only Birkin would form a close and abiding connection with her, she would be safe during this fretful voyage of life. He could make her sound and triumphant over the very angels of heaven. If only he would do it. But she was tortured with fear, with misgiving. She made herself beautiful. She strove so hard to come to that degree of beauty and advantage when he should be convinced. But always there was a deficiency. He was perverse too. He fought her off. He always fought her off. The more she strove to bring him to her, the more he battled her back. And they had been lovers now for years. Oh, it was so wearying, so aching. She was so tired. But still she believed in herself. She knew he was trying to leave her. She knew he was trying to break away from her finally, to be free. But still she believed in her strength to keep him. She believed in her own higher knowledge. His own knowledge was high. She was the central touchstone of truth. She only needed his conjunction with her. And this conjunction with her, which was his highest fulfillment also, with the perverseness of a willful child he wanted to deny. With the willfulness of an obstinate child, he wanted to break the holy connection that was between them. He would be at this wedding. He was to be groom's man. He would be in the church, waiting. He would know when she came. She shuddered with nervous apprehension and desire as she went through the church door. He would be there. Surely he would see how beautiful her dress was. Surely he would see how she had made herself beautiful for him. He would understand. He would be able to see how she was made for him, the first, how she was for him the highest. Surely at last he would be able to accept his highest fate. He would not deny her. In a little convulsion of too tired yearning, she entered the church and looked slowly along her cheeks for him, her slender body convulsed with agitation. As best man, he would be standing beside the altar. She looked slowly, deferring in her certainty. And then he was not there. A terrible storm came over her as if she were drowning. She was possessed by a devastating hopelessness, and she approached mechanically to the altar. Never had she known such a pang of utter and final hopelessness. It was beyond death, so utterly null, desert. The bridegroom and the groom's man had not yet come. There was a growing consternation outside. Ursula felt almost responsible. She could not bear it that the bride should arrive, and no groom. The wedding must not be a fiasco, it must not. But here was the bride's carriage, adorned with ribbons and cockades. Gaily the gray horses curveted to their destination at the church gate, a laughter in the whole movement. Here was the quick of all laughter and pleasure. The door of the carriage was thrown open to let out the very blossom of the day. The people on the roadway murmured faintly with the discontented murmuring of a crowd. The father stepped out first into the air of the morning, like a shadow. He was a tall, thin, careworn man, with a thin black beard that was touched with gray. He waited at the door of the carriage patiently, self-obliterated. In the opening of the doorway was a shower of fine foliage and flowers, a whiteness of satin and lace, and a sound of a gay voice saying, "How do I get out?" A ripple of satisfaction ran through the expectant people. They pressed near to receive her, looking with zest at the stooping blonde head with its flower buds, and at the delicate, white, tentative foot that was reaching down to the step of the carriage. There was a sudden foaming rush, and the bride like a sudden surf rush, floating all white beside her father in the morning shadow of trees, her veil flowing with laughter. "That's done it," she said. She put her hand on the arm of her careworn, sallow father and, frothing her light draperies, proceeded over the eternal red carpet. Her father, mute and yellowish, his black beard making him look more careworn, mounted the steps stiffly, as if his spirit were absent, but the laughing mist of the bride went along with him undiminished. And no bridegroom had arrived. It was intolerable for her. Ursula, her heart strained with anxiety, was watching the hill beyond, the white, descending road that should give sight of him. There was a carriage. It was running. It had just come into sight. Yes, it was he. Ursula turned towards the bride and the people, and, from her place of vantage, gave an inarticulate cry. She wanted to warn them that he was coming, but her cry was inarticulate and inaudible, and she flushed deeply between her desire and her wincing confusion. The carriage rattled down the hill and drew near. There was a shout from the people. The bride, who had just reached the top of the steps, turned round gaily to see what was the commotion. She saw a confusion among the people, a cab pulling up, and her lover dropping out of the carriage and dodging among the horses and into the crowd. "Tibbs! Tibbs!" she cried in her sudden, mocking excitement, standing high on the path in the sunlight and waving her bouquet. He, dodging with his hat in his hand, had not heard. "Tibbs!" she cried again, looking down to him. He glanced up, unaware, and saw the bride and her father standing on the path above him. A queer, startled look went over his face. He hesitated for a moment. Then he gathered himself together for a leap, to overtake her. "Ah-h-h," came her strange, intonicant cry, as, on the reflex, she started, turned and fled, scudding with an unthinkable swift beating of her white feet and fraying of her white garments, towards the church. Like a hound the young man was after her, leaping the steps and swinging past her father, his supple haunches working like those of a hound that bears down on the quarry. "Aye, after her!" cried the vulgar women below, carried suddenly into the sport. She, her flowers shaken from her like froth, was steadying herself to turn the angle of the church. She glanced behind, and with a wild cry of laughter and challenge, veered, poised, and was gone beyond the gray stone buttress. In another instant the bridegroom, bent forward as he ran, had caught the angle of the silent stone with his hand, and had swung himself out of sight, his supple, strong loins vanishing in pursuit. Instantly cries and exclamations of excitement burst from the crowd at the gate. And then Ursula noticed again the dark, rather stooping figure of Mr. Critch, waiting suspended on the path, watching with expressionless face the flight to the church. It was over, and he turned round to look behind him at the figure of Rupert Birkin, who at once came forward and joined him. "We'll bring up the rear," said Birkin, a faint smile on his face. "Aye," replied the father laconically, and the two men turned together up the path. Birkin was as thin as Mr. Critch, pale and ill-looking. His figure was narrow but nicely made. He went with a slight trail of 1 foot, which came only from self-consciousness. Although he was dressed correctly for his part, yet there was an innate incongruity which caused a slight ridiculousness in his appearance. His nature was clever and separate. He did not fit at all in the conventional occasion. Yet he subordinated himself to the common idea, travestied himself. He affected to be quite ordinary, perfectly and marvelously commonplace. And he did it so well, taking the tone of his surroundings, adjusting himself quickly to his interlocutor and his circumstance, that he achieved a verisimilitude of ordinary commonplaceness that usually propitiated his onlookers for the moment, disarmed them from attacking his singleness. Now he spoke quite easily and pleasantly to Mr. Critch as they walked along the path. He played with situations like a man on a tightrope, but always on a tightrope, pretending nothing but ease. "I'm sorry we are so late," he was saying. "We couldn't find a button hook, so it took us a long time to button our boots. But you were to the moment." "We are usually to time," said Mr. Critch. "And I'm always late," said Birkin. "But today I was really punctual, only accidentally not so. I'm sorry." The two men were gone. There was nothing more to see for the time. Ursula was left thinking about Birkin. He piqued her, attracted her, and annoyed her. She wanted to know him more. She had spoken with him once or twice, but only in his official capacity as inspector. She thought he seemed to acknowledge some kinship between her and him, a natural, tacit understanding, a using of the same language. But there had been no time for the understanding to develop, and something kept her from him, as well as attracted her to him. There was a certain hostility, a hidden ultimate reserve in him, cold and inaccessible. Yet she wanted to know him. "What do you think of Rupert Birkin?" she asked, a little reluctantly of Gudrun. She did not want to discuss him. "What do I think of Rupert Birkin?" repeated Gudrun. "I think he's attractive, decidedly attractive. What I can't stand about him is his way with other people, his way of treating any little fool as if she were his greatest consideration. One feels so awfully sold oneself." "Why does he do it?" said Ursula. "Because he has no real critical faculty of people at all events," said Gudrun. "I tell you, he treats any little fool as he treats me or you, and it's such an insult." "Oh, it is," said Ursula. "One must discriminate." "One must discriminate," repeated Gudrun. "But he's a wonderful chap, in other respects a marvelous personality. But you can't trust him." "Yes," said Ursula vaguely. She was always forced to assent to Gudrun's pronouncements, even when she was not in accord altogether. The sisters sat silent, waiting for the wedding party to come out. Gudrun was impatient of talk. She wanted to think about Gerald Critch. She wanted to see if the strong feeling she had got from him was real. She wanted to have herself ready. Inside the church, the wedding was going on. Hermione Rawdice was thinking only of Birkin. He stood near her. She seemed to gravitate physically towards him. She wanted to stand touching him. She could hardly be sure he was near her if she did not touch him. Yet she stood subjected through the wedding service. She had suffered so bitterly when he did not come that still she was dazed. Still she was gnawed as by a neuralgia, tormented by his potential absence from her. She had awaited him in a faint delirium of nervous torture. As she stood bearing herself pensively, the rapt look on her face, that seemed spiritual, like the angels, but which came from torture, gave her a certain poignancy that tore his heart with pity. He saw her bowed head, her rapt face, the face of an almost demoniacal ecstatic. Feeling him looking, she lifted her face and sought his eyes, her own beautiful gray eyes flaring him a great signal. But he avoided her look. She sank her head in torment and shame, the gnawing at her heart going on. And he too was tortured with shame and ultimate dislike, and with acute pity for her, because he did not want to meet her eyes. He did not want to receive her flare of recognition. The bride and bridegroom were married. The party went into the vestry. Hermione crowded involuntarily up against Birkin to touch him, and he endured it. Outside, Gudrun and Ursula listened for their fathers playing on the organ. He would enjoy playing a wedding march. Now, the married pair were coming. The bells were ringing, making the air shake. Ursula wondered if the trees and the flowers could feel the vibration and what they thought of it, this strange motion in the air. The bride was quite demure on the arm of the bridegroom, who stared up into the sky before him, shutting and opening his eyes unconsciously, as if he were neither here nor there. He looked rather comical, blinking and trying to be in the scene, when emotionally he was violated by his exposure to a crowd. He looked a typical naval officer, manly, and up to his duty. Birkin came with Hermione. She had a rapt, triumphant look, like the fallen angels restored, yet still subtly demoniacal. Now she held Birkin by the arm, and he was expressionless, neutralized, possessed by her as if it were his fate, without question. Gerald Critch came, fair, good-looking, healthy, with a great reserve of energy. He was erect and complete. There was a strange stealth glistening through his amiable, almost happy appearance. Gudrun rose sharply and went away. She could not bear it. She wanted to be alone, to know this strange, sharp inoculation that had changed the whole temper of her blood.
2.
Shortlands. The Brangwens went home to Beldover. The wedding party gathered at Shortlands, the Critches' home. It was a long, low old house, a sort of manor farm, that spread along the top of a slope just beyond the narrow little lake of Wily Water. Shortlands looked across a sloping meadow that might be a park, because of the large, solitary trees that stood here and there, across the water of the narrow lake, at the wooded hill that successfully hid the colliery valley beyond, but did not quite hide the rising smoke. Nevertheless, the scene was rural and picturesque, very peaceful, and the house had a charm of its own. It was crowded now with the family and the wedding guests. The father, who was not well, withdrew to rest. Gerald was host. He stood in the homely entrance hall, friendly and easy, attending to the men. He seemed to take pleasure in his social functions. He smiled and was abundant in hospitality. The women wandered about in a little confusion, chased hither and thither by the 3 married daughters of the house. All the while there could be heard the characteristic, imperious voice of one Critch woman or another calling, "Helen, come here a minute. Marjorie, I want you here. Oh, I say, Mrs. Witham." There was a great rustling of skirts, swift glimpses of smartly dressed women. A child danced through the hall and back again. A maidservant came and went hurriedly. Meanwhile, the men stood in calm little groups, chatting, smoking, pretending to pay no heed to the rustling animation of the women's world. But they could not really talk because of the glassy revel of women's excited, cold laughter and running voices. They waited, uneasy, suspended, rather bored. But Gerald remained as if genial and happy, unaware that he was waiting or unoccupied, knowing himself the very pivot of the occasion. Suddenly, Mrs. Critch came noiselessly into the room, peering about with her strong, clear face. She was still wearing her hat and her sack coat of blue silk. "What is it, Mother?" said Gerald. "Nothing, nothing," she answered vaguely. And she went straight towards Birkin, who was talking to a Critch brother-in-law. "How do you do, Mr. Birkin?" she said in her low voice that seemed to take no count of her guests. She held out her hand to him. "Oh, Mrs. Critch," replied Birkin in his readily changing voice, "I couldn't come to you before." "I don't know half the people here," she said in her low voice. Her son-in-law moved uneasily away. "And you don't like strangers?" laughed Birkin. "I myself can never see why one should take account of people just because they happen to be in the room with one. Why should I know they're there?" Why indeed, said Mrs. Critch in her low, tense voice. "Except that they are there. I don't know people whom I find in the house. The children introduced them to me. Mother, this is Mr. So-and-so. I am no further. What has Mr. So-and-so to do with his own name? And what have I to do with either him or his name?" She looked up at Birkin. She startled him. He was flattered too that she came to talk to him, for she took hardly any notice of anybody. He looked down at her tense, clear face with its heavy features, but he was afraid to look into her heavy-seeing blue eyes. He noticed instead how her hair looped in slack, slovenly strands over her rather beautiful ears, which were not quite clean. Neither was her neck perfectly clean, even in that he seemed to belong to her, rather than to the rest of the company, though, he thought to himself, he was always well washed, at any rate at the neck and ears. He smiled faintly, thinking these things. Yet he was tense, feeling that he and the elderly, estranged woman were conferring together like traitors, like enemies within the camp of the other people. He resembled a deer that throws one ear back upon the trail behind and one ear forward, to know what is ahead. "People don't really matter," he said, rather unwilling to continue. The mother looked up at him with sudden, dark interrogation, as if doubting his sincerity. "How do you mean matter?" she asked sharply. "Not many people are anything at all," he answered, forced to go deeper than he wanted to. "They jingle and giggle. It would be much better if they were just wiped out. Essentially, they don't exist, they aren't there." She watched him steadily while he spoke. "But we didn't imagine them," she said sharply. "There's nothing to imagine. That's why they don't exist." "Well," she said, "I would hardly go as far as that. There they are, whether they exist or no. It doesn't rest with me to decide on their existence. I only know that I can't be expected to take count of them all. You can't expect me to know them just because they happen to be there. As far as I go, they might as well not be there." "Exactly," he replied. "Mightn't they?" she asked again. "Just as well," he repeated. And there was a little pause. "Except that they are there, and that's a nuisance," she said. "There are my sons-in-law," she went on in a sort of monologue. "Now Laura's got married. There's another. And I really don't know John from James yet. They come up to me and call me mother. I know what they will say. How are you, mother? I ought to say, I am not your mother in any sense. But what is the use? There they are. I have had children of my own. I suppose I know them from another woman's children." "One would suppose so," he said. She looked at him, somewhat surprised, forgetting perhaps that she was talking to him. And she lost her thread. She looked round the room, vaguely. Birkin could not guess what she was looking for, nor what she was thinking. Evidently, she noticed her sons. "Are my children all there?" she asked him abruptly. He laughed, startled, afraid perhaps. "I scarcely know them, except Gerald," he replied. "Gerald," she exclaimed. "He's the most wanting of them all. You'd never think it, to look at him now, would you?" "No," said Birkin. The mother looked across at her eldest son, stared at him heavily for some time. She said, in an incomprehensible monosyllable that sounded profoundly cynical. Birkin felt afraid, as if he dared not realize. And Mrs. Critch moved away, forgetting him, but she returned on her traces. "I should like him to have a friend," she said. "He has never had a friend." Birkin looked down into her eyes, which were blue, and watching heavily. He could not understand them. "Am I my brother's keeper?" he said to himself, almost flippantly. Then he remembered, with a slight shock, that was Cain's cry. And Gerald was Cain, if anybody. Not that he was Cain, either, although he had slain his brother. There was such a thing as pure accident, and the consequences did not attach to one, even though one had killed one's brother in such wise. Gerald, as a boy, had accidentally killed his brother. What then? Why seek to draw a brand and a curse across the life that had caused the accident? A man can live by accident and die by accident. Or can he not? Is every man's life subject to pure accident? Is it only the race, the genus, the species, that has a universal reference? Or is this not true? Is there no such thing as pure accident? Has everything that happens a universal significance? Has it? Birkin, pondering as he stood there, had forgotten Mrs. Critch as she had forgotten him. He did not believe that there was any such thing as accident. It all hung together in the deepest sense. Just as he had decided this, one of the Critch daughters came up, saying, "Won't you come and take your hat off, mother dear? We shall be sitting down to eat in a minute, and it's a formal occasion, darling, isn't it?" She drew her arm through her mother's, and they went away. Birkin immediately went to talk to the nearest man. The gong sounded for the luncheon. The men looked up, but no move was made to the dining room. The women of the house seemed not to feel that the sound had meaning for them. 5 minutes passed by. The elderly manservant, Crowther, appeared in the doorway exasperatedly. He looked with appeal at Gerald. The latter took up a large, curved conch shell that lay on a shelf and, without reference to anybody, blew a shattering blast. It was a strange, rousing noise that made the heart beat. The summons was almost magical. Everybody came running, as if at a signal. And then the crowd in one impulse moved to the dining room. Gerald waited a moment for his sister to play hostess. He knew his mother would pay no attention to her duties, but his sister merely crowded to her seat. Therefore the young man, slightly too dictatorial, directed the guests to their places. There was a moment's lull, as everybody looked at the hors d'oeuvres that were being handed round. And out of this lull, a girl of 13 or 14, with her long hair down her back, said in a calm, self-possessed voice, "Gerald, you forget father when you make that unearthly noise." "Do I?" he answered. And then, to the company, "Father is lying down. He is not quite well." "How is he really?" called one of the married daughters, peeping round the immense wedding cake that towered up in the middle of the table, shedding its artificial flowers. "He has no pain, but he feels tired," replied Winifred, the girl with the hair down her back. The wine was filled, and everybody was talking boisterously. At the far end of the table sat the mother, with her loosely looped hair. She had Birkin for a neighbor. Sometimes she glanced fiercely down the rows of faces, bending forwards and staring unceremoniously. And she would say in a low voice to Birkin, Who is that young man? I don't know, Birkin answered discreetly. Have I seen him before? She asked. I don't think so. I haven't, he replied, and she was satisfied. Her eyes closed wearily. A peace came over her face. She looked like a queen in repose. Then she started. A little social smile came on her face. For a moment, she looked the pleasant hostess. For a moment, she bent graciously, as if everyone were welcome and delightful. And then immediately the shadow came back. A sullen, eagle look was on her face. She glanced from under her brows like a sinister creature at bay, hating them all. Mother, called Diana, a handsome girl a little older than Winifred. I may have wine, mayn't I? Yes, you may have wine, replied the mother automatically, for she was perfectly indifferent to the question. And Diana beckoned to the footman to fill her glass. Gerald shouldn't forbid me, she said calmly to the company at large. All right, Dee, said her brother amiably, and she glanced challenge at him as she drank from her glass. There was a strange freedom that almost amounted to anarchy in the house. It was rather a resistance to authority than liberty. Gerald had some command by mere force of personality, not because of any granted position. There was a quality in his voice, amiable but dominant, that cowed the others, who were all younger than he. Hermione was having a discussion with the bridegroom about nationality. No, she said, I think that the appeal to patriotism is a mistake. It is like one house of business rivaling another house of business. Well, you can hardly say that, can you? Exclaimed Gerald, who had a real passion for discussion. You couldn't call a race a business concern, could you? And nationality roughly corresponds to race, I think. I think it is meant to. There was a moment's pause. Gerald and Hermione were always strangely but politely and evenly inimical. Do you think race corresponds with nationality? She asked musingly, with expressionless indecision. Birkin knew she was waiting for him to participate, and dutifully he spoke up. I think Gerald is right. Race is the essential element in nationality, in Europe at least, he said. Again Hermione paused, as if to allow this statement to cool. Then she said with strange assumption of authority, yes, but even so, is the patriotic appeal an appeal to the racial instinct? Is it not rather an appeal to the proprietary instinct, the commercial instinct? And isn't this what we mean by nationality? Probably, said Birkin, who felt that such a discussion was out of place and out of time. But Gerald was now on the scent of argument. A race may have its commercial aspect, he said. In fact, it must. It is like a family. You must make provision. And to make provision, you have got to strive against other families, other nations. I don't see why you shouldn't. Again, Hermione made a pause, domineering and cold, before she replied, yes, I think it is always wrong to provoke a spirit of rivalry. It makes bad blood, and bad blood accumulates. But you can't do away with the spirit of emulation altogether, said Gerald. It is one of the necessary incentives to production and improvement. Yes, came Hermione's sauntering response. I think you can do away with it. I must say, said Birkin, I detest the spirit of emulation. Hermione was biting a piece of bread, pulling it from between her teeth with her fingers, in a slow, slightly derisive movement. She turned to Birkin. You do hate it, yes, she said, intimate and gratified. Detest it, he repeated. Yes, she murmured, assured and satisfied. But, Gerald insisted, you don't allow one man to take away his neighbor's living. So why should you allow one nation to take away the living from another nation? There was a long, slow murmur from Hermione before she broke into speech, saying with a laconic indifference, it is not always a question of possessions, is it? It is not all a question of goods. Gerald was nettled by this implication of vulgar materialism. Yes, more or less, he retorted. If I go and take a man's hat from off his head, that hat becomes a symbol of that man's liberty. When he fights me for his hat, he is fighting me for his liberty. Hermione was nonplussed. Yes, she said, irritated. But that way of arguing by imaginary instances is not supposed to be genuine, is it? A man does not come and take my hat from off my head, does he? Only because the law prevents him, said Gerald. Not only, said Birkin. 99 men out of 100 don't want my hat. "That's a matter of opinion," said Gerald. "Or the hat," laughed the bridegroom. "And if he does want my hat such as it is," said Birkin, "why, surely it is open to me to decide, which is a greater loss to me, my hat or my liberty as a free and indifferent man. If I am compelled to offer fight, I lose the latter. It is a question which is worth more to me, my pleasant liberty of conduct or my hat." "Yes," said Hermione, watching Birkin strangely. "Yes." "But would you let somebody come and snatch your hat off your head?" the bride asked of Hermione. The face of the tall, straight woman turned slowly and as if drugged to this new speaker. "No," she replied, in a low, inhuman tone that seemed to contain a chuckle. "No, I shouldn't let anybody take my hat off my head." "How would you prevent it?" asked Gerald. "I don't know," replied Hermione slowly. "Probably I should kill him." There was a strange chuckle in her tone, a dangerous and convincing humor in her bearing. "Of course," said Gerald, "I can see Rupert's point. It is a question to him whether his hat or his peace of mind is more important." "Peace of body," said Birkin. "Well, as you like there," replied Gerald. "But how are you going to decide this for a nation?" "Heaven preserve me," laughed Birkin. "Yes, but suppose you have to?" Gerald persisted. "Then it is the same. If the national crown piece is an old hat, then the thieving gent may have it. But can the national or racial hat be an old hat?" insisted Gerald. "Pretty well bound to be, I believe," said Birkin. "I'm not so sure," said Gerald. "I don't agree, Rupert," said Hermione. "All right," said Birkin. "I'm all for the old national hat," laughed Gerald. "And a fool you look in it," cried Diana, his pert sister, who was just in her teens. "Oh, we're quite out of our depths with these old hats," cried Laura Critch. "Dry up now, Gerald. We're going to drink toasts. Let us drink toasts. Toasts, glasses, glasses. Now then, toasts. Speech. Speech." Birkin, thinking about race or national death, watched his glass being filled with champagne. The bubbles broke at the rim. The man withdrew, and feeling a sudden thirst at the sight of the fresh wine, Birkin drank up his glass. A queer little tension in the room roused him. He felt a sharp constraint. "Did I do it by accident or on purpose?" he asked himself. And he decided that, according to the vulgar phrase, he had done it accidentally on purpose. He looked round at the hired footman, and the hired footman came, with a silent step of cold, servant-like disapprobation. Birkin decided that he detested toasts and footmen and assemblies and mankind altogether, in most of its aspects. Then he rose to make a speech, but he was somehow disgusted. At length it was over, the meal. Several men strolled out into the garden. There was a lawn and flower beds, and at the boundary an iron fence shutting off the little field or park. The view was pleasant, a high road curving round the edge of a low lake, under the trees. In the spring air, the water gleamed, and the opposite woods were purplish with new life. Charming Jersey cattle came to the fence, breathing hoarsely from their velvet muzzles at the human beings, expecting perhaps a crust. Birkin leaned on the fence. A cow was breathing wet hotness on his hand. "Pretty cattle, very pretty," said Marshall, one of the brothers-in-law. "They give the best milk you can have." "Yes," said Birkin. My little beauty, my beauty," said Marshall, in a queer high falsetto voice that caused the other man to have convulsions of laughter in his stomach. "Who won the race, Lupton?" he called to the bridegroom, to hide the fact that he was laughing. The bridegroom took his cigar from his mouth. "The race?" he exclaimed. Then a rather thin smile came over his face. He did not want to say anything about the flight to the church door. "We got there together. At least she touched first, but I had my hand on her shoulder." "What's this?" asked Gerald. Birkin told him about the race of the bride and the bridegroom. Said Gerald, in disapproval. "What made you late then?" "Lupton would talk about the immortality of the soul," said Birkin, and then he hadn't got a button-hook. "Oh God," cried Marshall. "The immortality of the soul on your wedding day. Hadn't you got anything better to occupy your mind?" "What's wrong with it?" asked the bridegroom, a clean-shaven naval man, flushing sensitively. "Sounds as if you were going to be executed instead of married." The immortality of the soul, repeated the brother-in-law with most killing emphasis. But he fell quite flat. And what did you decide? Asked Gerald, at once pricking up his ears at the thought of a metaphysical discussion. You don't want a soul today, my boy, said Marshall. It'd be in your road. Christ, Marshall, go and talk to somebody else, cried Gerald, with sudden impatience. By God, I'm willing, said Marshall in a temper. Too much bloody soul, and talk altogether. He withdrew in a dudgeon, Gerald staring after him with angry eyes that grew gradually calm and amiable as the stoutly built form of the other man passed into the distance. There's one thing, Lupton, said Gerald, turning suddenly to the bridegroom. Laura won't have brought such a fool into the family as Lottie did. Comfort yourself with that, laughed Birkin. I take no notice of them, laughed the bridegroom. What about this race then? Who began it? Gerald asked. We were late. Laura was at the top of the churchyard steps when our cab came up. She saw Lupton bolting towards her, and she fled. But why do you look so cross? Does it hurt your sense of the family dignity? It does rather, said Gerald. If you're doing a thing, do it properly, and if you're not going to do it properly, leave it alone. Very nice aphorism, said Birkin. Don't you agree? Asked Gerald. Quite, said Birkin. Only it bores me rather when you become aphoristic. Damn you, Rupert. You want all the aphorisms your own way, said Gerald. No. I want them out of the way, and you're always shoving them in it. Gerald smiled grimly at this humorism. Then he made a little gesture of dismissal with his eyebrows. You don't believe in having any standard of behavior at all, do you? He challenged Birkin censoriously. Standard? No. I hate standards. But they're necessary for the common ruck. Anybody who is anything can just be himself and do as he likes. But what do you mean by being himself? Said Gerald. Is that an aphorism or a cliche? I mean just doing what you want to do. I think it was perfect good form in Laura to bolt from Lupton to the church door. It was almost a masterpiece in good form. It's the hardest thing in the world to act spontaneously on one's impulses, and it's the only really gentlemanly thing to do, provided you're fit to do it. You don't expect me to take you seriously, do you? Asked Gerald. Yes, Gerald. You're one of the very few people I do expect that of. Then I'm afraid I can't come up to your expectations here, at any rate. You think people should just do as they like. I think they always do, but I should like them to like the purely individual thing in themselves, which makes them act in singleness. And they only like to do the collective thing. And I, said Gerald grimly, should like to be in a world of people who acted individually and spontaneously, as you call it. We should have everybody cutting everybody else's throat in 5 minutes. That means you would like to be cutting everybody's throat, said Birkin. How does that follow? Asked Gerald crossly. No man, said Birkin, cuts another man's throat unless he wants to cut it, and unless the other man wants it cutting. This is a complete truth. It takes two people to make a murder, a murderer and a murderee. And a murderee is a man who is murderable. And a man who is murderable is a man who in a profound if hidden lust desires to be murdered. Sometimes you talk pure nonsense, said Gerald to Birkin. As a matter of fact, none of us wants our throat cut, and most other people would like to cut it for us, some time or other. It's a nasty view of things, Gerald, said Birkin, and no wonder you are afraid of yourself and your own unhappiness. How am I afraid of myself, said Gerald, and I don't think I am unhappy. You seem to have a lurking desire to have your gizzard slit, and imagine every man has his knife up his sleeve for you, Birkin said. How do you make that out, said Gerald. From you, said Birkin. There was a pause of strange enmity between the two men that was very near to love. It was always the same between them. Always their talk brought them into a deadly nearness of contact, a strange, perilous intimacy which was either hate or love, or both. They parted with apparent unconcern, as if their going apart were a trivial occurrence, and they really kept it to the level of trivial occurrence. Yet the heart of each burned from the other. They burned with each other, inwardly. This they would never admit. They intended to keep their relationship a casual, free and easy friendship. They were not going to be so unmanly and unnatural as to allow any heartburning between them. They had not the faintest belief in deep relationship between men, and their disbelief prevented any development of their powerful but suppressed friendliness. 3. Classroom. A school day was drawing to a close. In the classroom, the last lesson was in progress, peaceful and still. It was elementary botany. The desks were littered with catkins, hazel and willow, which the children had been sketching. But the sky had come overdark. As the end of the afternoon approached, there was scarcely light to draw anymore. Ursula stood in front of the class, leading the children by questions to understand the structure and the meaning of the catkins. A heavy, copper-colored beam of light came in at the west window, gilding the outlines of the children's heads with red gold, and falling on the wall opposite in a rich, ruddy illumination. Ursula, however, was scarcely conscious of it. She was busy. The end of the day was here. The work went on as a peaceful tide that is at flood, hushed to retire. This day had gone by like so many more, in an activity that was like a trance. At the end, there was a little haste to finish what was in hand. She was pressing the children with questions so that they should know all they were to know by the time the gong went. She stood in shadow in front of the class, with catkins in her hand, and she leaned towards the children, absorbed in the passion of instruction. She heard, but did not notice the click of the door. Suddenly she started. She saw, in the shaft of ruddy, copper-colored light near her, the face of a man. It was gleaming like fire, watching her, waiting for her to be aware. It startled her terribly. She thought she was going to faint. All her suppressed, subconscious fear sprang into being, with anguish. "Did I startle you?" said Birkin, shaking hands with her. "I thought you had heard me come in." "No," she faltered, scarcely able to speak. He laughed, saying he was sorry. She wondered why it amused him. "It is so dark," he said. "Shall we have the light?" And moving aside, he switched on the strong electric lights. The classroom was distinct and hard, a strange place after the soft, dim magic that filled it before he came. Birkin turned curiously to look at Ursula. Her eyes were round and wondering. Bewildered, her mouth quivered slightly. She looked like one who was suddenly wakened. There was a living, tender beauty, like a tender light of dawn shining from her face. He looked at her with a new pleasure, feeling gay in his heart, irresponsible. "You're doing catkins?" he asked, picking up a piece of hazel from a scholar's desk in front of him. "Are they as far out as this? I hadn't noticed them this year." He looked absorbedly at the tassel of hazel in his hand. "The red ones too," he said, looking at the flickers of crimson that came from the female bud. Then he went in among the desks to see the scholar's books. Ursula watched his intent progress. There was a stillness in his motion that hushed the activities of her heart. She seemed to be standing aside in arrested silence, watching him move in another, concentrated world. His presence was so quiet, almost like a vacancy in the corporate air. Suddenly, he lifted his face to her, and her heart quickened at the flicker of his voice. "Give them some crayons, won't you?" he said, "so that they can make the genius flowers red and the androgynous yellow. I'd chalk them in plain, chalk and nothing else, merely the red and the yellow. Outline scarcely matters in this case. There is just the one fact to emphasize." "I haven't any crayons," said Ursula. "There will be some somewhere, red and yellow. That's all you want." Ursula sent out a boy on a quest. "It will make the books untidy," she said to Birkin, flushing deeply. "Not very," he said. "You must mark in these things, obviously. It's the fact you want to emphasize, not the subjective impression to record." "What's the fact?" "Red little spiky stigmas of the female flower, dangling yellow male catkin, yellow pollen flying from one to the other. Make a pictorial record of the fact, as a child does when drawing a face. 2 eyes, 1 nose, mouth with teeth. So," and he drew a figure on the blackboard. At that moment, another vision was seen through the glass panels of the door. It was Hermione Rawdice. Birkin went and opened to her. "I saw your car," she said to him. "Do you mind my coming to find you? I wanted to see you when you were on duty." She looked at him for a long time, intimate and playful, then she gave a short little laugh. And then only she turned to Ursula, who, with all the class, had been watching the little scene between the lovers. "How do you do, Miss Brangwen?" sang Hermione in her low, odd, singing fashion that sounded almost as if she were poking fun. "Do you mind my coming in?" Her gray, almost sardonic eyes rested all the while on Ursula, as if summing her up. "Oh no," said Ursula. "Are you sure?" repeated Hermione, with complete sang-froid and an odd, half-bullying effrontery. "Oh no, I like it awfully," laughed Ursula, a little bit excited and bewildered, because Hermione seemed to be compelling her, coming very close to her, as if intimate with her. And yet, how could she be intimate? This was the answer Hermione wanted. She turned satisfied to Birkin. "What are you doing?" she sang in her casual, inquisitive fashion. "Catkins," he replied. "Really?" she said. "And what do you learn about them?" She spoke all the while in a mocking, half-teasing fashion, as if making game of the whole business. She picked up a twig of the catkin, piqued by Birkin's attention to it. She was a strange figure in the classroom, wearing a large, old cloak of greenish cloth, on which was a raised pattern of dull gold. The high collar and the inside of the cloak was lined with dark fur. Beneath she had a dress of fine lavender-colored cloth, trimmed with fur, and her hat was close-fitting, made of fur and of the dull, green and gold figured stuff. She was tall and strange. She looked as if she had come out of some new, bizarre picture. "Do you know the little red ovary flowers that produce the nuts? Have you ever noticed them?" he asked her. And he came close and pointed them out to her, on the sprig she held. "No," she replied. "What are they?" "Those are the little seed-producing flowers, and the long catkins, they only produce pollen, to fertilize them." Do they?" repeated Hermione, looking closely. "From those little red bits, the nuts come, if they receive pollen from the long danglers." Little red flames," murmured Hermione to herself. And she remained for some moments, looking only at the small buds out of which the red flickers of the stigma issued. "Aren't they beautiful?" "I think they're so beautiful," she said, moving close to Birkin and pointing to the red filaments with her long, white finger. "Had you never noticed them before?" he asked. "No, never before," she replied. "And now you will always see them," he said. "Now I shall always see them," she repeated. "Thank you so much for showing me. I think they're so beautiful, little red flames." Her absorption was strange, almost rhapsodic. Both Birkin and Ursula were suspended. The little red pistillate flowers had some strange, almost mystic passionate attraction for her. The lesson was finished, the books were put away, at last the class was dismissed. And still Hermione sat at the table, with her chin in her hand, her elbow on the table, her long white face pushed up, not attending to anything. Birkin had gone to the window and was looking from the brilliantly lighted room onto the gray, colorless outside, where rain was noiselessly falling. Ursula put away her things in the cupboard. At length Hermione rose and came near to her. "Your sister has come home?" she said. "Yes," said Ursula. "And does she like being back in Beldover?" "No," said Ursula. "No, I wonder she can bear it. It takes all my strength to bear the ugliness of this district when I stay here. Won't you come and see me? Won't you come with your sister to stay at Bruttleby for a few days?" "Do." "Thank you very much," said Ursula. "Then I will write to you," said Hermione. "You think your sister will come? I should be so glad. I think she is wonderful. I think some of her work is really wonderful. I have 2 water wagtails carved in wood and painted. Perhaps you have seen it." "No," said Ursula. "I think it is perfectly wonderful, like a flash of instinct." "Her little carvings are strange," said Ursula. "Perfectly beautiful, full of primitive passion. Isn't it queer that she always likes little things? She must always work small things that one can put between one's hands, birds and tiny animals. She likes to look through the wrong end of the opera glasses and see the world that way. Why is it, do you think?" Hermione looked down at Ursula with that long, detached, scrutinizing gaze that excited the younger woman. "Yes," said Hermione at length. "It is curious. The little things seem to be more subtle to her. But they aren't, are they? A mouse isn't any more subtle than a lion, is it?" Again Hermione looked down at Ursula with that long scrutiny, as if she were following some train of thought of her own and barely attending to the other's speech.
"I don't know," she replied.
"Rupert, Rupert," she sang mildly, calling him to her. He approached in silence. "Are little things more subtle than big things?" she asked, with the odd grunt of laughter in her voice, as if she were making game of him in the question. "Dunno," he said. "I hate subtleties," said Ursula. Hermione looked at her slowly. "Do you?" she said. "I always think they are a sign of weakness," said Ursula, up in arms, as if her prestige were threatened. Hermione took no notice. Suddenly her face puckered. Her brow was knit with thought. She seemed twisted in troublesome effort for utterance. "Do you really think, Rupert," she asked, as if Ursula were not present, "do you really think it is worthwhile? Do you really think the children are better for being roused to consciousness?" A dark flash went over his face, a silent fury. He was hollow-cheeked and pale, almost unearthly, and the woman, with her serious, conscience-harrowing question, tortured him on the quick. "They are not roused to consciousness," he said. "Consciousness comes to them willy-nilly. But do you think they are better for having it quickened, stimulated? Isn't it better that they should remain unconscious of the hazel? Isn't it better that they should see as a whole, without all this pulling to pieces, all this knowledge? Would you rather, for yourself, know or not know, that the little red flowers are there, putting out for the pollen?" he asked harshly. His voice was brutal, scornful, cruel. Hermione remained with her face lifted up, abstracted. He hung silent in irritation. "I don't know," she replied, balancing mildly. "I don't know. But knowing is everything to you. It is all your life," he broke out. She slowly looked at him. "Is it?" she said. "To know, that is your all, that is your life. You have only this knowledge," he cried. "There is only one tree, there is only one fruit in your mouth." Again she was sometimes silent. "Is there?" she said at last, with the same untouched calm. And then in a tone of whimsical inquisitiveness, "What fruit, Rupert?" "The eternal apple," he replied in exasperation, hating his own metaphors. "Yes," she said. There was a look of exhaustion about her. For some moments there was silence. Then, pulling herself together with a convulsed movement, Hermione resumed, in a sing-song, casual voice. "But leaving me apart, Rupert, do you think the children are better, richer, happier for all this knowledge? Do you really think they are? Or is it better to leave them untouched, spontaneous? Hadn't they better be animals, simple animals, crude, violent, anything, rather than this self-consciousness, this incapacity to be spontaneous?" They thought she had finished, but with a queer rumbling in her throat she resumed, "Hadn't they better be anything than grow up crippled, crippled in their souls, crippled in their feelings, so thrown back, so turned back on themselves, incapable?" Hermione clenched her fist like one in a trance, "of any spontaneous action, always deliberate, always burdened with choice, never carried away." Again they thought she had finished, but just as he was going to reply, she resumed her queer rhapsody. "Never carried away, out of themselves, always conscious, always self-conscious, always aware of themselves. Isn't anything better than this? Better be animals, mere animals with no mind at all, than this nothingness." "But do you think it is knowledge that makes us unliving and self-conscious?" he asked irritably. She opened her eyes and looked at him slowly. "Yes," she said. She paused, watching him all the while, her eyes vague. Then she wiped her fingers across her brow, with a vague weariness. It irritated him bitterly. "It is the mind," she said, "and that is death." She raised her eyes slowly to him. "Isn't the mind," she said, with the convulsed movement of her body, "isn't our death? Doesn't it destroy all our spontaneity, all our instincts? Are not the young people growing up today really dead before they have a chance to live?" "Not because they have too much mind, but too little," he said brutally. "Are you sure?" she cried. "It seems to me the reverse. They are overconscious, burdened to death with consciousness. Imprisoned within a limited, false set of concepts," he cried. But she took no notice of this, only went on with her own rhapsodic interrogation. "When we have knowledge, don't we lose everything but knowledge? she asked pathetically. If I know about the flower, don't I lose the flower and have only the knowledge? Aren't we exchanging the substance for the shadow? Aren't we forfeiting life for this dead quality of knowledge? And what does it mean to me, after all? What does all this knowing mean to me? It means nothing. You are merely making words, he said. Knowledge means everything to you, even your animalism. You want it in your head. You don't want to be an animal, you want to observe your own animal functions to get a mental thrill out of them. It is all purely secondary and more decadent than the most hidebound intellectualism. What is it but the worst and last form of intellectualism, this love of yours for passion and the animal instincts? Passion and the instincts, you want them hard enough, but through your head in your consciousness. It all takes place in your head, under that skull of yours. Only you won't be conscious of what actually is. You want a lie that will match the rest of your furniture. Hermione set hard and poisonous against this attack. Ursula stood covered with wonder and shame. It frightened her to see how they hated each other. It's all that Lady of Shalott business, he said, in his strong, abstract voice. He seemed to be charging her before the unseeing air. You've got that mirror, your own fixed will, your immortal understanding, your own tight conscious world, and there is nothing beyond it. There, in the mirror, you must have everything. But now you have come to all your conclusions. You want to go back and be like a savage, without knowledge. You want a life of pure sensation and passion. He quoted the last words satirically against her. She sat convulsed with fury and violation, speechless, like a stricken pythoness of the Greek oracle. But your passion is a lie, he went on violently. It isn't passion at all, it is your will. It's your bullying will. You want to clutch things and have them in your power. You want to have things in your power.
And why?
Because you haven't got any real body, any dark, sensual body of life. You have no sensuality. You have only your will and your conceit of consciousness, and your lust for power, to know. He looked at her in mingled hate and contempt, also in pain because she suffered, and in shame because he knew he tortured her. He had an impulse to kneel and plead for forgiveness, but a bitterer red anger burned up to fury in him. He became unconscious of her. He was only a passionate voice speaking. Spontaneous, he cried. You and spontaneity. You, the most deliberate thing that ever walked or crawled. You'd be verily deliberately spontaneous, that's you. Because you want to have everything in your own volition, your deliberate voluntary consciousness. You want it all in that loathsome little skull of yours that ought to be cracked like a nut. For you'll be the same till it is cracked, like an insect in its skin. If one cracked your skull, perhaps one might get a spontaneous, passionate woman out of you, with real sensuality. As it is, what you want is pornography. Looking at yourself in mirrors, watching your naked animal actions in mirrors, so that you can have it all in your consciousness, make it all mental. There was a sense of violation in the air, as if too much was said, the unforgivable. Yet Ursula was concerned now only with solving her own problems in the light of his words. She was pale and abstracted. But do you really want sensuality? She asked, puzzled. Birkin looked at her and became intent in his explanation. Yes, he said, that and nothing else at this point. It is a fulfillment. The great dark knowledge you can't have in your head, the dark involuntary being. It is death to oneself, but it is the coming into being of another. But how? How can you have knowledge not in your head? She asked, quite unable to interpret his phrases. In the blood, he answered. When the mind and the known world is drowned in darkness, everything must go. There must be the deluge. Then you find yourself a palpable body of darkness, a demon. But why should I be a demon? She asked. Woman wailing for her demon lover, he quoted. Why, I don't know. Hermione roused herself as from a death annihilation. He is such a dreadful Satanist, isn't he? She drawled to Ursula in a queer, resonant voice that ended on a shrill little laugh of pure ridicule. The two women were jeering at him, jeering him into nothingness. The laugh of the shrill, triumphant female sounded from Hermione, jeering him as if he were a neuter.
No, he said.
You are the real devil who won't let life exist. She looked at him with a long, slow look, malevolent, supercilious. "You know all about it, don't you?" she said, with slow, cold, cunning mockery. "Enough," he replied, his face fixing fine and clear like steel. A horrible despair, and at the same time a sense of release, liberation, came over Hermione. She turned with a pleasant intimacy to Ursula. "You are sure you will come to Brettleby?" she said, urging. "Yes, I should like to very much," replied Ursula. Hermione looked down at her, gratified, reflecting, and strangely absent, as if possessed, as if not quite there. "I'm so glad," she said, pulling herself together. "Some time in about a fortnight." "Yes, I will write to you here, at the school, shall I?"
Yes.
"And you'll be sure to come?"
Yes.
"I shall be so glad."
Goodbye.
"Goodbye." Hermione held out her hand and looked into the eyes of the other woman. She knew Ursula as an immediate rival, and the knowledge strangely exhilarated her. Also, she was taking leave. It always gave her a sense of strength, advantage, to be departing and leaving the other behind. Moreover, she was taking the man with her, if only in hate. Birkin stood aside, fixed and unreal. But now, when it was his turn to bid goodbye, he began to speak again. "There's the whole difference in the world," he said, "between the actual sensual being and the vicious mental deliberate profligacy our lot goes in for. In our nighttime, there's always the electricity switched on, we watch ourselves. We get it all in the head, really. You've got to lapse out before you can know what sensual reality is. Lapse into unknowingness and give up your volition. You've got to do it. You've got to learn not to be before you can come into being. But we have got such a conceit of ourselves. That's where it is. We are so conceited and so unproud. We've got no pride. We're all conceit. So conceited in our own papier-mâché realized selves. We'd rather die than give up our little self-righteous, self-opinionated self-will." There was silence in the room. Both women were hostile and resentful. He sounded as if he were addressing a meeting. Hermione merely paid no attention, stood with her shoulders tight in a shrug of dislike. Ursula was watching him as if furtively, not really aware of what she was seeing. There was a great physical attractiveness in him, a curious hidden richness that came through his thinness and his pallor like another voice, conveying another knowledge of him. It was in the curves of his brows and his chin, rich, fine, exquisite curves, the powerful beauty of life itself.
She could not say what it was.
But there was a sense of richness and of liberty. "But we are sensual enough, without making ourselves so, aren't we?" she asked, turning to him with a certain golden laughter flickering under her greenish eyes, like a challenge. And immediately the queer, careless, terribly attractive smile came over his eyes and brows, though his mouth did not relax. "No," he said, "we aren't. We're too full of ourselves." "Surely it isn't a matter of conceit," she cried. "That and nothing else." She was frankly puzzled. "Don't you think that people are most conceited of all about their sensual powers?" she asked. "That's why they aren't sensual, only sensuous, which is another matter. They're always aware of themselves, and they're so conceited that rather than release themselves and live in another world, from another center, they'd—" "You want your tea, don't you?" said Hermione, turning to Ursula with a gracious kindliness. "You've worked all day." Birkin stopped short. A spasm of anger and chagrin went over Ursula. His face set, and he bade goodbye, as if he had ceased to notice her. They were gone. Ursula stood looking at the door for some moments. Then she put out the lights, and having done so, she sat down again in her chair, absorbed and lost. And then she began to cry, bitterly, bitterly weeping. But whether for misery or joy, she never knew.
4. Diver.
The week passed away. On the Saturday it rained, a soft drizzling rain that held off at times. In one of the intervals Gudrun and Ursula set out for a walk, going towards Wily Water. The atmosphere was gray and translucent. The birds sang sharply on the young twigs. The earth would be quickening and hastening in growth. The two girls walked swiftly, gladly, because of the soft, subtle rush of morning that filled the wet haze. By the road the blackthorn was in blossom. White and wet, its tiny amber grains burning faintly in the white smoke of blossom. Purple twigs were darkly luminous in the gray air. High hedges glowed like living shadows, hovering nearer, coming into creation. The morning was full of a new creation. When the sisters came to Wily Water, the lake lay all gray and visionary, stretching into the moist, translucent vista of trees and meadow. Fine electric activity and sound came from the dumbles below the road, the birds piping one against the other, and water mysteriously plashing, issuing from the lake. The two girls drifted swiftly along. In front of them, at the corner of the lake, near the road, was a mossy boathouse under a walnut tree and a little landing stage where a boat was moored, wavering like a shadow on the still gray water, below the green, decayed poles. All was shadowy with coming summer. Suddenly, from the boathouse, a white figure ran out, frightening in its swift, sharp transit, across the old landing stage. It launched in a white arc through the air. There was a bursting of the water, and among the smooth ripples a swimmer was making out to space, in a center of faintly heaving motion. The whole other world, wet and remote, he had to himself. He could move into the pure translucency of the gray, uncreated water. Gudrun stood by the stone wall, watching. "How I envy him," she said, in low, desirous tones. "Ugh," shivered Ursula. "So cold." "Yes, but how good, how really fine to swim out there." The sisters stood watching the swimmer move further into the gray, moist, full space of the water, pulsing with his own small, invading motion, and arched over with mist and dim woods. "Don't you wish it were you?" asked Gudrun, looking at Ursula. "I do," said Ursula, "but I'm not sure. It's so wet." "No," said Gudrun, reluctantly. She stood watching the motion on the bosom of the water, as if fascinated. He, having swum a certain distance, turned round and was swimming on his back, looking along the water at the two girls by the wall. In the faint wash of motion, they could see his ruddy face and could feel him watching them. "It is Gerald Critch," said Ursula. "I know," replied Gudrun, and she stood motionless, gazing over the water at the face which washed up and down on the flood as he swam steadily. From his separate element he saw them, and he exulted to himself because of his own advantage, his possession of a world to himself. He was immune and perfect. He loved his own vigorous, thrusting motion and the violent impulse of the very cold water against his limbs, buoying him up. He could see the girls watching him away off, outside, and that pleased him. He lifted his arm from the water, in a sign to them. "He is waving," said Ursula. "Yes," replied Gudrun. They watched him. He waved again, with a strange movement of recognition across the difference. "Like a Nibelung," laughed Ursula. Gudrun said nothing, only stood still looking over the water. Gerald suddenly turned, and was swimming away swiftly, with a side stroke. He was alone now, alone and immune in the middle of the waters, which he had all to himself. He exulted in his isolation in the new element, unquestioned and unconditioned. He was happy, thrusting with his legs and all his body, without bond or connection anywhere, just himself in the watery world. Gudrun envied him almost painfully. Even this momentary possession of pure isolation and fluidity seemed to her so terribly desirable that she felt herself as if damned, out there on the highroad. "God, what it is to be a man!" she cried. "What?" exclaimed Ursula in surprise. "The freedom, the liberty, the mobility," cried Gudrun, strangely flushed and brilliant. "You're a man, you want to do a thing, you do it. You haven't the 1,000 obstacles a woman has in front of her." Ursula wondered what was in Gudrun's mind to occasion this outburst. She could not understand. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Nothing," cried Gudrun, in swift refutation. "But supposing I did? Supposing I want to swim up that water? It is impossible. It is one of the impossibilities of life, for me to take my clothes off now and jump in. But isn't it ridiculous? Doesn't it simply prevent our living?" She was so hot, so flushed, so furious, that Ursula was puzzled. The two sisters went on up the road. They were passing between the trees just below Shortlands. They looked up at the long, low house, dim and glamorous in the wet morning, its cedar trees slanting before the windows. Gudrun seemed to be studying it closely. "Don't you think it's attractive, Ursula?" asked Gudrun. "Very," said Ursula. "Very peaceful and charming. It has form, too. It has a period." "What period?" "Oh, 18th century for certain. Dorothy Wordsworth and Jane Austen, don't you think?" Ursula laughed. "Don't you think so?" repeated Gudrun. "Perhaps. But I don't think the Krishes fit the period. I know Gerald is putting in a private electric plant for lighting the house and is making all kinds of latest improvements." Gudrun shrugged her shoulders swiftly. "Of course," she said. "That's quite inevitable." "Quite," laughed Ursula. "He is several generations of youngness at one go. They hate him for it. He takes them all by the scruff of the neck and fairly flings them along. He'll have to die soon, when he's made every possible improvement, and there will be nothing more to improve. He's got go, anyhow." "Certainly he's got go," said Gudrun. "In fact, I've never seen a man that showed signs of so much. The unfortunate thing is, where does his go to? What becomes of it?" "Oh, I know," said Ursula. "It goes in applying the latest appliances." "Exactly," said Gudrun. "You know he shot his brother?" said Ursula. "Shot his brother?" cried Gudrun, frowning as if in disapprobation. "Didn't you know?" "Oh, yes. I thought you knew. He and his brother were playing together with a gun. He told his brother to look down the gun, and it was loaded, and blew the top of his head off. Isn't it a horrible story?" "How fearful," cried Gudrun. "But it is long ago." "Oh, yes, they were quite boys," said Ursula. "I think it is one of the most horrible stories I know." "And he, of course, did not know that the gun was loaded?"
Yes.
"You see, it was an old thing that had been lying in the stable for years. Nobody dreamed it would ever go off, and, of course, no one imagined it was loaded. But isn't it dreadful that it should happen?" "Frightful," cried Gudrun. "And isn't it horrible, too, to think of such a thing happening to one when one was a child, and having to carry the responsibility of it all through one's life? Imagine it, two boys playing together. Then this comes upon them, for no reason whatever, out of the air. Ursula, it's very frightening." "Oh, it's one of the things I can't bear. Murder, that is thinkable because there's a will behind it. But a thing like that to happen to one." "Perhaps there was an unconscious will behind it," said Ursula. "This playing at killing has some primitive desire for killing in it, don't you think?" "Desire," said Gudrun, coldly, stiffening a little. "I can't see that they were even playing at killing. I suppose one boy said to the other, 'You look down the barrel while I pull the trigger and see what happens.' It seems to me the purest form of accident." "No," said Ursula. "I couldn't pull the trigger of the emptiest gun in the world, not if someone were looking down the barrel. One instinctively doesn't do it, one can't." Gudrun was silent for some moments, in sharp disagreement. "Of course," she said coldly, "if one is a woman and grown up, one's instinct prevents one. But I cannot see how that applies to a couple of boys playing together." Her voice was cold and angry. "Yes," persisted Ursula. At that moment they heard a woman's voice a few yards off say loudly, "Oh, damn the thing." They went forward and saw Laura Critch and Hermione Roddice in the field on the other side of the hedge, and Laura Critch struggling with the gate to get out. Ursula at once hurried up and helped to lift the gate. "Thanks so much," said Laura, looking up flushed and Amazon-like, yet rather confused. "It isn't right on the hinges." "No," said Ursula, "and they're so heavy." "Surprising," cried Laura. "How do you do?" sang Hermione from out of the field, the moment she could make her voice heard. "It's nice now. Are you going for a walk?" "Yes." "Isn't the young green beautiful?" "So beautiful. Quite burning." Good morning, you'll come and see me?" "Thank you so much. Next week." "Yes, goodbye. G-O-D-B-Y." Gudrun and Ursula stood and watched her slowly waving her head up and down, and waving her hand slowly in dismissal, smiling a strange, affected smile, making a tall, queer, frightening figure, with her heavy fair hair slipping to her eyes. Then they moved off, as if they had been dismissed like inferiors. The four women parted. As soon as they had gone far enough, Ursula said, her cheeks burning, "I do think she's impudent." "Who? Hermione Radice?" asked Gudrun. "Why?" "The way she treats one impudence." "Why? Ursula, what did you notice that was so impudent?" asked Gudrun rather coldly.
Her whole manner.
"Oh, it's impossible, the way she tries to bully one. Pure bullying. She's an impudent woman. You'll come and see me, as if we should be falling over ourselves for the privilege." "I can't understand, Ursula, what you are so much put out about," said Gudrun, in some exasperation. "One knows those women are impudent, these free women who have emancipated themselves from the aristocracy." "But it is so unnecessary, so vulgar," cried Ursula. "No, I don't see it."
And if you did, pour moi, elle n'existe pas.
"I don't grant her the power to be impudent to me." "Do you think she likes you?" asked Ursula. "Well, no, I shouldn't think she did." "Then why does she ask you to go to Bruttleby and stay with her?" Gudrun lifted her shoulders in a low shrug. "After all, she's got the sense to know we're not just the ordinary run," said Gudrun. "Whatever she is, she's not a fool. And I'd rather have somebody I detested than the ordinary woman who keeps to her own set. Hermione Radice does risk herself in some respects." Ursula pondered this for a time. "I doubt it," she replied. "Really, she risks nothing. I suppose we ought to admire her for knowing she can invite us, school teachers, and risk nothing." "Precisely," said Gudrun. "Think of the myriads of women that daren't do it. She makes the most of her privileges. That's something. I suppose, really, we should do the same in her place." "No," said Ursula.
No.
"It would bore me. I couldn't spend my time playing her games. It's in for a dig." The two sisters were like a pair of scissors, snipping off everything that came athwart them, or like a knife and a whetstone, the one sharpened against the other. "Of course," cried Ursula suddenly, "she ought to thank her stars if we will go and see her. You are perfectly beautiful, 1,000 times more beautiful than ever she is or was, and to my thinking, 1,000 times more beautifully dressed, for she never looks fresh and natural, like a flower, always old, thought out, and we are more intelligent than most people." "Undoubtedly," said Gudrun. "And it ought to be admitted, simply," said Ursula. "Certainly it ought," said Gudrun. "But you'll find that the really chic thing is to be so absolutely ordinary, so perfectly commonplace and like the person in the street, that you really are a masterpiece of humanity. Not the person in the street, actually, but the artistic creation of her." "How awful," cried Ursula. "Yes, Ursula, it is awful, in most respects. You daren't be anything that isn't amazingly autera, so much autera that it is the artistic creation of ordinariness." "It's very dull to create oneself into nothing better," laughed Ursula. "Very dull," retorted Gudrun. "Really, Ursula, it is dull. That's just the word. One longs to be high-flown and make speeches like Corneille after it." Gudrun was becoming flushed and excited over her own cleverness. "Strut," said Ursula. "One wants to strut, to be a swan among geese." "Exactly," cried Gudrun. "A swan among geese." "They are all so busy playing the ugly duckling," cried Ursula, with mocking laughter. "And I don't feel a bit like a humble and pathetic ugly duckling. I do feel like a swan among geese. I can't help it. They make one feel so. And I don't care what they think of me."
Je m'en fiche.
Gudrun looked up at Ursula with a queer, uncertain envy and dislike. "Of course, the only thing to do is to despise them all, just all," she said. The sisters went home again to read and talk and work and wait for Monday for school. Ursula often wondered what else she waited for, besides the beginning and end of the school week, and the beginning and end of the holidays. This was a whole life. Sometimes she had periods of tight horror, when it seemed to her that her life would pass away and be gone, without having been more than this. But she never really accepted it. Her spirit was active, her life like a shoot that is growing steadily, but which has not yet come above ground.
V.
In the train. One day at this time Birkin was called to London. He was not very fixed in his abode. He had rooms in Nottingham because his work lay chiefly in that town. but often he was in London or in Oxford. He moved about a great deal. His life seemed uncertain, without any definite rhythm, any organic meaning. On the platform of the railway station, he saw Gerald Critch, reading a newspaper and evidently waiting for the train. Birkin stood some distance off, among the people. It was against his instinct to approach anybody. From time to time, in a manner characteristic of him, Gerald lifted his head and looked round. Even though he was reading the newspaper closely, he must keep a watchful eye on his external surroundings. There seemed to be a dual consciousness running in him. He was thinking vigorously of something he read in the newspaper, and at the same time his eye ran over the surfaces of the life round him, and he missed nothing. Birkin, who was watching him, was irritated by his duality. He noticed, too, that Gerald seemed always to be at bay against everybody, in spite of his queer, genial, social manner when roused. Now Birkin started violently at seeing this genial look flash onto Gerald's face, at seeing Gerald approaching with hand outstretched. "Hello, Rupert. Where are you going?" "London. So are you, I suppose." "Yes." Gerald's eyes went over Birkin's face in curiosity. "We'll travel together if you like," he said. "Don't you usually go first?" asked Birkin. "I can't stand the crowd," replied Gerald. "But third'll be all right. There's a restaurant car. We can have some tea." The two men looked at the station clock, having nothing further to say. "What were you reading in the paper?" Birkin asked. Gerald looked at him quickly. "Isn't it funny what they do put in the newspapers?" he said. "Here are 2 leaders." He held out his Daily Telegraph, full of the ordinary newspaper cant. He scanned the columns down. "And then there's this little, I don't know what you'd call it, essay almost, appearing with the leaders and saying there must arise a man who will give new values to things, give us new truths, a new attitude to life, or else we shall be a crumbling nothingness in a few years, a country in ruin." "I suppose that's a bit of newspaper cant as well," said Birkin. "It sounds as if the man meant it, and quite genuinely," said Gerald. "Give it to me," said Birkin, holding out his hand for the paper. The train came and they went on board, sitting on either side a little table, by the window in the restaurant car. Birkin glanced over his paper, then looked up at Gerald, who was waiting for him. "I believe the man means it," he said, "as far as he means anything." "And do you think it's true? Do you think we really want a new gospel?" asked Gerald. Birkin shrugged his shoulders. "I think the people who say they want a new religion are the last to accept anything new. They want novelty, right enough. But to stare straight at this life that we've brought upon ourselves and reject it, absolutely smash up the old idols of ourselves, that we sh shall never do. You've got very badly to want to get rid of the old, before anything new will appear, even in the self." Gerald watched him closely. "You think we ought to break up this life? Just start and let fly?" he asked. "This life? Yes, I do. We've got to bust it completely or shrivel inside it, as in a tight skin, for it won't expand anymore." There was a queer little smile in Gerald's eyes, a look of amusement, calm and curious. "And how do you propose to begin? I suppose you mean reform the whole order of society?" he asked. Birkin had a slight, tense frown between the brows. He too was impatient of the conversation. "I don't propose at all," he replied. "When we really want to go for something better, we shall smash the old. Until then, any sort of proposal, or making proposals, is no more than a tiresome game for self-important people." The little smile began to die out of Gerald's eyes, and he said, looking with a cool stare at Birkin, "So you really think things are very bad? Completely bad?" The smile appeared again. "In what way?" "Every way," said Birkin. "We are such dreary liars. Our one idea is to lie to ourselves. We have an ideal of a perfect world, clean and straight and sufficient. So we cover the earth with foulness. Life is a blotch of labor, like insects scurrying in filth, so that your collier can have a pianoforte in his parlor, and you can have a butler and a motor car in your up-to-date house. And as a nation we can sport the Ritz, or the Empire, Gaby Deslys, and the Sunday newspapers. It is very dreary." Gerald took a little time to readjust himself after this tirade. "Would you have us live without houses? Return to nature?" he asked. "I would have nothing at all. People only do what they want to do and what they are capable of doing. If they were capable of anything else, there would be something else. Again, Gerald pondered. He was not going to take offense at Birkin. Don't you think the collier's pianoforte, as you call it, is a symbol for something very real, a real desire for something higher in the collier's life? Higher, cried Birkin.
Yes.
Amazing heights of upright grandeur. It makes him so much higher in his neighboring collier's eyes. He sees himself reflected in the neighboring opinion, like in a Brocken mist, several feet taller on the strength of the pianoforte, and he is satisfied. He lives for the sake of that Brocken specter, the reflection of himself in the human opinion. You do the same. If you are of high importance to humanity, you are of high importance to yourself. That is why you work so hard at the mines. If you can produce coal to cook 5,000 dinners a day, you are 5,000 times more important than if you cooked only your own dinner. I suppose I am, laughed Gerald. Can't you see, said Birkin, that to help my neighbor to eat is no more than eating myself? I eat, thou eatest, he eats, we eat, you eat, they eat. And what then? Why should every man decline the whole verb? First person singular is enough for me. You've got to start with material things, said Gerald, which statement Birkin ignored. And we've got to live for something. We're not just cattle that can graze and have done with it, said Gerald. Tell me, said Birkin, what do you live for? Gerald's face went baffled. What do I live for? He repeated. I suppose I live to work, to produce something, insofar as I am a purpose of being. Apart from that, I live because I am living. And what's your work? Getting so many more thousands of tons of coal out of the earth every day. And when we've got all the coal we want, and all the plush furniture and pianofortes, and the rabbits are all stewed and eaten, and we're all warm and our bellies are filled, and we're listening to the young lady performing on the pianoforte, what then? What then, when you've made a real fair start with your material things? Gerald sat laughing at the words and the mocking humor of the other man. But he was cogitating too. We haven't got there yet, he replied. A good many people are still waiting for the rabbit and the fire to cook it. So while you get the coal, I must chase the rabbit? Said Birkin, mocking at Gerald. Something like that, said Gerald. Birkin watched him narrowly. He saw the perfect good-humored callousness, even strange, glistening malice, in Gerald, glistening through the plausible ethics of productivity. Gerald, he said, I rather hate you. I know you do, said Gerald. Why do you? Birkin mused inscrutably for some minutes. I should like to know if you are conscious of hating me, he said at last. Do you ever consciously detest me, hate me with mystic hate? There are odd moments when I hate you starly. Gerald was rather taken aback, even a little disconcerted. He did not quite know what to say. I may, of course, hate you sometimes, he said, but I'm not aware of it, never acutely aware of it, that is. So much the worse, said Birkin. Gerald watched him with curious eyes. He could not quite make him out. So much the worse, is it? He repeated. There was a silence between the two men for some time, as the train ran on. In Birkin's face was a little irritable tension, a sharp knitting of the brows, keen and difficult. Gerald watched him warily, carefully, rather calculatingly, for he could not decide what he was after. Suddenly Birkin's eyes looked straight and overpowering into those of the other man. What do you think is the aim and object of your life, Gerald? He asked. Again, Gerald was taken aback. He could not think what his friend was getting at. Was he poking fun or not? At this moment, I couldn't say offhand, he replied, with faintly ironic humor. Do you think love is the be-all and the end-all of life? Birkin asked, with direct, attentive seriousness. Of my own life, said Gerald. Yes. There was a really puzzled pause. I can't say, said Gerald. It hasn't been, so far. What has your life been, so far? Oh, finding out things for myself, and getting experiences, and making things go. Birkin knitted his brows like sharply molded steel. I find, he said, that one needs some one really pure single activity. I should call love a single pure activity. But I don't really love anybody, not now. Have you ever really loved anybody? Asked Gerald. Yes and no, replied Birkin. Not finally, said Gerald. Finally, no, said Birkin. Nor I, said Gerald. And do you want to? Said Birkin. Gerald looked with a long, twinkling, almost sardonic look into the eyes of the other man. I don't know, he said. I do. I want to love, said Birkin. You do?
Yes.
I want the finality of love. The finality of love, repeated Gerald. And he waited for a moment. Just one woman, he added. The evening light, flooding yellow along the fields, lit up Birkin's face with a tense, abstract steadfastness. Gerald still could not make it out. Yes, one woman, said Birkin. But to Gerald it sounded as if he were insistent rather than confident. I don't believe a woman, and nothing but a woman, will ever make my life, said Gerald. Not the center and core of it, the love between you and a woman? Asked Birkin. Gerald's eyes narrowed with a queer, dangerous smile as he watched the other man. I never quite feel it that way, he said. You don't? Then wherein does life center for you? I don't know. That's what I want somebody to tell me. As far as I can make out, it doesn't center at all. It is artificially held together by the social mechanism. Birkin pondered as if he would crack something. I know, he said. It just doesn't center. The old ideals are dead as nails. Nothing there. It seems to me there remains only this perfect union with a woman, sort of ultimate marriage, and there isn't anything else. And you mean if there isn't the woman, there's nothing? Said Gerald. Pretty well that, seeing there's no God. Then we're hard put to it, said Gerald. And he turned to look out of the window at the flying, golden landscape. Birkin could not help seeing how beautiful and soldierly his face was, with a certain courage to be indifferent. You think it's heavy odds against us? Said Birkin. If we've got to make our life up out of a woman, one woman, woman only, yes, I do, said Gerald. I don't believe I shall ever make up my life at that rate. Birkin watched him almost angrily. You are a born unbeliever, he said. I only feel what I feel, said Gerald. And he looked again at Birkin almost sardonically, with his blue, manly, sharp-lighted eyes. Birkin's eyes were at the moment full of anger, but swiftly they became troubled, doubtful, then full of a warm, rich affectionateness and laughter. It troubles me very much, Gerald, he said, wrinkling his brows. I can see it does, said Gerald, uncovering his mouth in a manly, quick, soldierly laugh. Gerald was held unconsciously by the other man. He wanted to be near him. He wanted to be within his sphere of influence. There was something very congenial to him in Birkin, but yet, beyond this, he did not take much notice. He felt that he himself, Gerald, had harder and more durable truths than any the other man knew. He felt himself older, more knowing. It was the quick-changing warmth and venality and brilliant, warm utterance he loved in his friend. It was the rich play of words and quick interchange of feelings he enjoyed. The real content of the words he never really considered. He himself knew better. Birkin knew this. He knew that Gerald wanted to be fond of him without taking him seriously, and this made him go hard and cold. As the train ran on, he sat looking at the land, and Gerald fell away, became as nothing to him. Birkin looked at the land at the evening and was thinking, well, if mankind is destroyed, if our race is destroyed like Sodom, and there is this beautiful evening with the luminous land and trees, I am satisfied. That which informs it all is there and can never be lost. After all, what is mankind but just one expression of the incomprehensible? And if mankind passes away, it will only mean that this particular expression is completed and done. That which is expressed and that which is to be expressed cannot be diminished. There it is in the shining evening. Let mankind pass away, time it did. The creative utterances will not cease. They will only be there. Humanity doesn't embody the utterance of the incomprehensible anymore. Humanity is a dead letter. There will be a new embodiment, in a new way. Let humanity disappear as quick as possible. Gerald interrupted him by asking, Where are you staying in London? Birkin looked up. With a man in Soho. I pay part of the rent of a flat and stop there when I like. Good idea. Have a place more or less your own, said Gerald.
Yes.
But I don't care for it much. I'm tired of the people I am bound to find there. What kind of people? Art, music, London bohemia, the most pettifogging, calculating bohemia that ever reckoned its pennies. But there are a few decent people, decent in some respects. They are really very thorough rejectors of the world. Perhaps they live only in the gesture of rejection and negation, but negatively something, at any rate. What are they? Painters, musicians,